Welcome to today's webinar on how to avoid common problems with your design, risk, and validation documentation. My name is Nick Tittman. I'm the VP of Marketing here at Greenlight Guru and your moderator for today's event. We got a really special presentation scheduled for you today. I know our presenter, Jim Cassie, is really looking forward to sharing with you his insights and best practices surrounding all things documentation during the design and development phase in order to mitigate risk and other systemic issues. Before we dive too deep into today's presentation and introduce our presenter and his consultancy, Holler Consulting Group, I'm going to touch on a few housekeeping items real quick. First, today's webinar is going to run for about 60 minutes in total and will include a Q&A session at the end where Jim has been kind enough to answer all your questions. So I encourage you to submit your questions throughout the webinar as they come up in the box on the right-hand side, and we'll get to as many of them as time permits. Secondly, I just want to share a few words about Greenlight Guru and why we put on these free training sessions. Have you been on one of our free training sessions before, then you know we put these on because improving the quality of life is our mission here at Greenlight Guru. Likely a similar mission as many of you on today's webinar. Anything that we can do as an organization that helps device makers bring safer, life-changing devices to market quicker and with less risk aligns with that mission. We're constantly looking for ways to fulfill that mission, whether that's through hosting these free training sessions, through partnering with world-class consultants like Jim Cassie and Holler Consulting Group, or through our award-winning quality management software platform. If you'd like to learn more about why medical device companies all over the globe in over 600 cities from 50 countries are ditching their broken paper-based quality systems and outdated legacy software for a new, modern quality management software platform designed exclusively from the ground up for device makers, and I'd encourage you to head on over to www.greenlight.guru after today's presentation and request your free personalized one-on-one demo. In it, you'll learn how some of the very best medical device companies are leveraging our quality management software platform to gain ISO 13485 certification, breeze through compliance audits, and push beyond compliance to true quality. So like I said, if you're interested in learning more about how we might be able to help your device company, be sure to go over to www.greenlightguru after today's session and schedule your personal demo. Okay, so on to the bulk of today's presentation. Let me give a proper introduction to your presenter today and a partner of ours here at Greenlight Guru, Jim Cassie. Jim has more than 20 years experience in quality systems and auditing. He has created, implemented, and served as a management representative for quality management systems in accordance with ISO 9001 and ISO 13485. He's been performing internal and supplier audits since early in his career and has trained and mentored many audit teams. Jim has been the primary contact for numerous inspections, third-party audits, and customer audits. Before joining Hollerin, Jim has held progressive roles in quality across various industries, including aerospace, electronic components, and medical devices. His most recent role was VP of Quality Assurance America for ResMed, a global manufacturer of non-invasive ventilation and sleep disordered breathing medical devices. Jim was responsible for all aspects of the quality management system at their corporate headquarters and two North American distribution facilities. Jim earned a Bachelor of Science in Engineering from Harvey Mudd College and a Master's of Business Administration from the University of Southern California. Through ASQ, Jim is a certified manager of quality operational excellence and a certified quality auditor. So without further ado, let me hand it over to your presenter today, Jim Cassie.
Thank you, Nick. I appreciate that. So for me, I've been with Halloran for 3 years as a consultant. Let me give you a little bit about Halloran. We're a life sciences consulting company. We have over 80 full-time employees. We've been in business for over 20 years. We have offices in the Boston area, which is our headquarters, and another office here in California. I am based in Southern California. We cover everything from clinical, regulatory, quality support for life sciences company, everything from pharma to medical devices, and have a distinguished list of clients that we've worked for. So getting on to today's topic, in the announcement and the sign up, we identified these objectives. Now, so what is all this about? What are we talking about? This whole presentation came from a conversation Nick and I had a couple of weeks ago. We were talking about quality management systems, design controls specifically. We were talking about where design controls has come from and where it's going to. And from that, we said there's definitely a topic here. And rather than focusing in on the individual elements of design controls, wanted to focus in on the connectivity between some of the elements within the design control element process. So design controls, the key to effective design controls is communication throughout the entire process. So we've all probably seen some version of this cartoon, and the reason it resonates so well through time and across industries is because it illustrates how difficult it is to have effective communication between all the stakeholders within the design and development process, from the customer all the way through the design and development to the delivery of the product. Within the design controls in the medical devices, the current state of design controls is defined by, within the US, it's defined by these sets of standards and regulations. You've got the FDA 21 CFR Part 820.30, you have ISO 13485, you've got ISO 14971 for risk management, and there's similar sets of regulations and standards in other regions around the world, and also there's similar sets of standards across different industries. As noted in my experience, I've worked in aerospace, I've supplied automotive components, so I've seen the similarities between the various QMSs and specifically design controls. So what are design controls? It's a set of procedures and practices for the design and development process, and the purpose is to ensure that the products that are manufactured are going to meet the user needs and intended uses. So within the design control regulations, this is a list of the different elements that are covered. This is listing out the FDA regulations for CFR 820.30. You see the different elements there, and I've also added in the risk management requirements of 14971. Now, the current state of design controls is actually relatively new. Many of these standards have been around for a couple of decades, all things considered, within many of our careers. And these regulation standards, the accepted or expected industry standards, continue to evolve and change. We've gone through updates to 1345, the recent implementation of 2016, increasing focus on the risk management. We've got other changes in regulations. I don't know how many of you have already gone through MD-SAP audits. I don't know how many of you already have initiatives in place to figure out how to evolve and implement your the EU MDR requirements and are looking at that. But this whole design control element and the greater QMS is constantly evolving and changing. What I want to focus in on are a couple of the elements within the design control process, the inputs, the outputs, verification, validation, risk management. And rather than getting into the nitty-gritty of what goes into each piece, I want to focus on the connectivity between these elements. So within the design control process, again, pulling up some of the classic representations of design controls, showing the connectivity between inputs and outputs, and how verification is the feedback loop to demonstrate the linkages there. You've got validation to demonstrate your finished device is meeting the user needs. Another way that we may have seen to document it is this sort of a V approach, the big V, demonstrating you've got from the inputs through development to getting to production of your product, and the feedback associated with the verification validation steps. So the first element, design inputs. Okay, what's the objective of the design inputs? It's to provide all of the input requirements from your functional performance, your risk management inputs, your regulatory requirements, all of these parts to fully define the product. So we see various different inputs go into this, user needs documents, market requirements documents, product descriptions, regulatory assessments. All of these things form parts of our design inputs. Now, this is something that I've seen a lot of change and evolution within this part of design controls. I know that early on, most organizations, they would have some sort of a product description, things like that, and then if you had a question for what are the regulatory inputs, then you'd scramble and find some sort of an email or maybe a regulatory assessment or something and say, okay, here's some of those inputs. And you'd have this collection of documentation that you would pull together to demonstrate what the full definition, the state of the product. I would call that stage one in a level of maturity. And then over time, you'd start to see some of the organizations would take those various inputs and distill them in and synthesize them into some sort of a document, MRD, a market requirements document, or a design input document, or something along those lines. And you'd have it all pulled together into a nice, neat package. And that way, by pulling them together, instead of having standalone elements, you could make sure that you've covered all the parts. If you had some template that you were filling out with that, or you could also, by pulling it together, help to identify and resolve any conflicting inputs between some of the various documents. Now what I'm starting to see is what I would consider a stage 3, or more the most mature type of approach, that not only have they pulled these things together, but a lot of times the document is in paragraph form. There's a lot of text in there, and it's hard to clearly identify the specific measurable requirements. Now, in the more developed market requirements documents I've seen, they've started to flag and put some sort of an identifier of each of the specific requirements, such that you could readily demonstrate them, that you're complying with them, and match them up with any of your validation documents or your design output documents, and you can match them up more effectively by flagging them. Now, based on my experience, whether small company, large company, different types of manufacturers, from capital equipment to smaller devices to medical software companies, I haven't seen very many that really go through and are at a stage 3 level. But to try to get a sense of what the audience and get some feedback from people, the rest of industry, a larger sample, I'd like to set up a polling question to see where a couple of polling questions through this presentation to see the level of maturity and how industry is handling this.
Alrighty, yeah, absolutely, Jim. So we got a first polling question, one of 3 that we're going to do here in today's presentation. So you all should see, just came up on your screen here. How mature would you consider your design control system? Deficient, compliant, advanced. So the responses are coming in here. We are at almost 50% of you have voted. Looks like it's holding pretty true here. So we got two-thirds of the vote in here. So right now we are at 20% deficient, 65% compliant, and 13% advanced. Looks like that's holding pretty true. So about 20, 65, 13. All right, we'll go ahead and close it up here.
Okay, thanks everybody, appreciate that. But I think that is indicative of my experience, and not very many people have gone to that next step. So the next part of it, so we've got the inputs. Now moving on to here the objective of the design output is to provide all the documentation that's necessary to deliver the product. And here, this is something that I've seen throughout my career, that organizations generally get the basic parts associated with the product down, because it's the core element necessary for the manufacturing process. They generally have their component drawings, assembly drawings, bills of materials, their product specification. Then there will be a little bit more variability on how and they'll go about documenting assembly instructions, test and inspection procedures. And I've seen a number of organizations that don't really pull into the engineering product specification, some of the labeling, some of the packaging, and even more remote would be some of the installation and servicing documentation. But all of those are necessary to ensure that you deliver a quality product through the full life cycle. It's not just getting a product to the end of the manufacturing line. You have to get it all the way to the end customer, the patient, the user of the product, and then you also have to be able to service the product as necessary. Again, it varies a little bit based on the nature of the product, but these are things that I've seen. So now here again, levels of maturity. Most companies, as I said, generally have stage 1. They have that basic information. Stage 2, they'll have all the information clearly pulled together. And here it's to demonstrate that you've satisfied all the design inputs. Some form of a compliance matrix is an effective way to demonstrate you've satisfied that. And here I see more companies starting to have some sort of a compliance matrix here. A lot of times, whether it's going back, companies I've worked for or gone in and audited, a lot of times, how do you demonstrate your design outputs, meet your design inputs, and you pull in some knowledgeable subject matter expert, and one of the key designers, and they say, oh, okay, this input that's covered over here on this drawing or this specification, and they're able to verbally demonstrate those links. However, when you get into some of the user requirements, I'll see an organization that the quality of the output or the answer that you get to some of those questions of how do you demonstrate or where is this design input covered in the design specifications is highly variable depending on who do you have in the room or who do you ask that question to. And this creates a risk for organizations. If during an FDA inspection you ask the wrong person, and that question, it can come across as if you have a deficiency. You might get a 483 out of that. But if you had a clear trace matrix between the inputs and outputs, it's less dependent on who you have answering these questions. Also, my experience, especially on more complex devices where you have large design teams, I could ask that question of 10 different people that were intimately involved within the design process. Ask the question, and I'll get a handful of different answers on where do we cover this design input in the design outputs. And when you have that variability, it creates risks of oversights, of mismatches, and things like that. So creating risks to the organization that are manageable. Now, then what I've seen in the most mature systems and processes is really a really clear trace matrix that links not only the design inputs and the outputs, but you have also links to your verification validation documents, your risk documentation. You start to pull all of those things together into a comprehensive trace or compliance matrix. So with that, we have our second polling question. So Nick.
All righty, Jim. So here we go. You should see it coming up on your screen now. So the second polling question here is, do you use trace matrices to document linkages between design elements? All right, answers are coming in. Over 50% voted now. We will close it down here in just a second. Still got some answers coming in. Looks like the results are holding true. All right, and we're gonna close it. I will share the results here. So it looks like basically 2/3 of you say yes and 1/3 of you say no. All right, Jim.
Okay. So great. So I'm glad to see a majority of people are using those. As I indicated, I'm seeing that more and more, but I still see a number of organizations that don't have that. Let's see. Excuse me, the slide deck jumped on me. There we go. Okay, that was okay. So again, so we've covered design inputs and outputs, and they're linked together, and I'm glad to hear that the majority are using trace matrices to document that linkages. Now moving on to verification validation. Now this is the feedback to demonstrate that you've satisfied all those requirements, and that to demonstrate that you've got a safe and effective device. And you'll have product examples of these: product performance testing, dimensional testing, reliability testing, your 60601 testing, usability, all sorts of things go into that. Now, here where I've seen the level of maturity that I see in this space is as a stage one. You've got a collection of test plans and reports. And so if you go through and ask a question of, show me how this was verified, or that was validated, it would require somebody to say, oh, that was covered in this test plan, and then here's the test report associated with this, and we demonstrate compliance. Now, what I'm seeing more and more, the companies that have better control over all of this, I would consider a stage two is you've got some sort of a master validation plan that's going to go in and say, this is how I'm going to do this test plan for 60601 testing. I'm going to do the following dimensional inspections to demonstrate, to verify that I meet the design outputs, whatever is necessary. If you have sterilization testing requirements, you might do some of that. You might, and you're able to pull all those pieces together. And again, by having a documented, cohesive plan, you're able to ensure that you don't have any gaps and oversights, that the overall program that you're putting together is right-sized for the product that you're producing. And then again, some form of a compliance matrix may exist. But then as you go through that, I'll find that the most mature companies and organizations will have a really strong validation program and really good trace matrices that is able to link inputs, outputs with your validation, and they also will link in with all their risk documentation. You'll put in their risk files on the mitigations. They'll have references to the verification validation tests. You will see that the test results will be used to inform the occurrence, expected occurrence rates that are within the risk files. Again, all the most mature systems are really working on the interconnectivity of these different elements. So mention just there the risk management. I wanted to take a minute here to cover that. So here we want to make sure that the 4 elements of a risk management system: analysis, evaluation, control, and your post production and post production feedback to continue to evolve that. Now, risk management. So most people are following 14971 and going through and updating to the latest versions of that. Even this standard within the medical device world is relatively new. I remember and is pulled from other industries and other areas. I remember the first FMEA that I saw was back in the 80s, associated with aerospace. It was a tool that was used back then, but then medical device, the 14971 came to be in the 90s, and it, when it first started, many organizations would just say, "Oh, do you have an FMEA?" Yes, no, and then got to get something together and put it in place. The initial ones were generally done during the design and development process. Once it got documented, it got stuck in a file and didn't really get looked at again. Nowadays, with the latest version of 14971, the increasing focus on risk management within 13485, the risk files are starting to become more of a living document as originally intended. And here again, I see an evolution of levels of maturity there, and within the, again, going from just a basic file it, create it and file it and pull it up when an auditor asks for it, type FMEA, towards a full, well implemented implementation of 14971 type risk management program, and the most mature really have an actively managed risk program where they're really taking that production data, complaint data, feeding that back in, adding new risks, updating your occurrence rates, making sure that the risks are managed effectively. And I think that it's going to continue to be a focus to make sure to evolve and become that much more active process. With that, we have our third and final polling question. So I'll hand that over to Nick.
All righty, Jim. So everybody should see the third question up on your screen now. If you use trace matrices, how do you manage them? Spreadsheets, in-house developed tool or database, or a commercially available tool, something like Greenlight Guru? All right, responses coming in here. Almost 60% voting. I'll leave it open for another 5-6 seconds here and get the final votes in. All righty, we're gonna shut it down. So we'll share the results here. So it looks like most of you are using a spreadsheet at 72%, 20% have an in-house developed tool or database, and about 17% are using a commercially available tool like Greenlight Guru.
Okay. Great. So now, with that, so a spreadsheet that works really good when you're trying to manage and demonstrate the linkages between two variables, design inputs to design outputs, or design outputs to your verification documentation. However, it becomes really a challenge to effectively link all of these elements that I think are necessary to really manage this the design control process that we've been talking about here. Again, hold on a second while I switch. I've lost my, there we go. Okay. So, like I said, the spreadsheets really become a challenge when you start to try to link your inputs and your outputs and your verification and your risk management, and I think that it's likely that the industry will shift, and it's going to become expected that all these things are clearly documented within some sort of a trace or compliance matrix. And I think that tools beyond a spreadsheet are going to become necessary to really effectively manage that. So one of the things that I wanted to, again, some of the evolution of the design control process is the assessment questions that we encounter, whether it's from internal auditors, or if it's from an inspector from a regulatory body, or our ISO auditors. Before I initially would see very siloed approaches to these different elements, and the questions would be fairly straightforward within an element. How are your user needs defined? Can you show me the records? Can you pull those up? And you go through and you talk about user needs for a while. Okay, so you've satisfied that requirement within ISO 13485, or you've covered that element within 21 CFR 82030, and you've checked that off, and you move on to the next element. Have you done a risk assessment? Have you done, can you show me your verification report for this component? And I would see those very siloed pieces and elements. Now, I'm not sure how many of you have faced some of these more complicated questions, but I know that the first time that I received one of these questions, it caught me a little bit on my back foot, and I went, let's see how I can draw these things connect and pull it together. Some of these questions would be, I've noticed several failures of the same type in your complaint records. Show me how this failure is covered in your risk files. Is the incident rate consistent with what you have documented in your risk file? And how was this feature validated during your design process? And then you scurry around and you try to You call up your subject matter experts, the guy that wrote the FMEA, and go, where's this covered? And you rummage around and you try to find the best fit. This is, again, where that really robust trace matrix would enable you to readily answer these sorts of questions, because everything's been connected and everything's tied together. Also, I see a key feature on a supply on a part. How are those design outputs flowed to your supplier, or things like that? Trying to connect all of these different elements is I think going to be the standard of the expectations within the industry, and I think we need to make sure that we have the tools to be able to effectively answer these questions. And I think that they're appropriate questions to make sure that we're effectively managing our products and the quality systems. So now this is here, coming back to the cartoon on design controls. This is what we're trying to achieve. We want to have effective communication between all phases of the development process, all entities within the organization, such that we're able to effectively and efficiently deliver a product that meets the user needs, and you're able to produce it effectively within your organization so that you can be profitable. The costs associated with not doing things right the first time. We've all seen the cost of quality associated with missing something during the design and development. I mean, right now, look what Boeing's going through, and with the grounding of all their airplanes. If something was missed during their verification, validation, and not, and that, the potential impacts for patient safety and product effectiveness are huge. And the cost of not doing it right up front and getting ahead of some of this documentation is large. I know of a company that we helped a company upgrade their risk documentation. They had a fairly complex device that their design documentation was spread out through a number of individual specifications. Their verification and testing was spread out again through a network of a bunch of different test documents, and they wanted to tie all of that together to make sure that their risk file was current and up to date to the new 14971 requirements. That exercise took over 1,000 hours of effort of trying to sift through all of the different inputs and outputs and validation documents to try to pull it together into a cohesive document so that we had all of those things linked together in the risk file. So the fact that this was after the fact and it's not fresh in everybody's mind makes it very difficult, if not impossible, to try to pull all this stuff together. So it's not something that you want to do after the fact or later or when it becomes expected, an industry standard. These are things that we should be thinking about now and get on it and make that relatively small incremental investment to make sure that we have all of these different design control elements connected and effectively documented now, such that we're ahead of the curve. So coming back to the objectives, I think we've gone through these elements. And with that, I'd like to open it up to any questions.
All righty, Jim. Well, thank you very much for sharing all that knowledge with us and going through the design control process and really talking to us about where you've seen being out in the field, where the market is heading, and best practices for documenting all your design control activities. So we got a pretty big list of questions here. Also, if people have more questions as they come in or as we kind of go through these, feel free to submit those in the question box on the right hand of your screen. So Floor asks, in your experience, Jim, does the DHF is the DHF updated during the medical device cycle, or is this effort frozen when the design is transferred to production?
So the DHF, so let's see. So I think that it's for a given version, you've got that locked down, and this is the design file for that version. You've got your design control, your change control processes that are going to provide updates as you create new versions of it. You know, so I think it's going to be frozen for a specific version of your product.
Okay, and he elaborated on that a bit. So he said, is a design review a required activity for a design change after the design has been frozen and transferred to manufacturing? Who are the members of this design review?
So your change control is going to have a set of defined participants. Generally, you're going to have quality, regulatory, manufacturing, and engineering. Some variations depending on the nature of the change. You don't have you don't have to have a separate design review for a change. If the product change that you're going to have is significant enough to the design, I would then say that that's going to be a new project, engineering project, and that you would kick back into your in your product development process. So for any given change, you're going to do an assessment whether or not it's large enough and more critical enough that you want to go through the design review or design and development process versus handling that change just through your change control process.
Gotcha. Thank you for elaborating on that. So Ruchi here asks, what goes into your design verification versus your design validation? Could you give maybe an example or two?
Okay. So examples, verification, dimensionally, does my product meet my specification? Does it, the form factor, does it have the basic outputs? It takes voltage in and delivers this output, whatever that might be. So your inputs and outputs, those are things that are verification type activities. Validation activities are things, do you do some user testing, clinical testing, and and to demonstrate that you're meeting the user needs. It's supposed to, you've got a device that is supposed to cut, and it's creating, let's say it's a thermal cutting, and it's supposed to, the tip is supposed to get to, 200 degrees or 100 degrees C or whatever the number is. You would test that the output of the tip is at that level, and that is an example of verification. But then you would then do a test to say, does it effectively cut and perform its function? That would be a validation. And so you're meeting the user needs.
Gotcha. And then Sky has asked a follow-on question related to software as a medical device. Do the differences change between verification and validation with a software device versus a hardware device?
Not really. But within a software device, things are a bit different, and it's on how the manufacturing process and how things are developed and documented and controlled. But here, a verification would be, let's say, I'm supposed to be able to display an image at a particular pixel, a specific level of resolution, and then that image is supposed to be used by a clinician to make a diagnosis. And so the validation would be whether or not they can effectively interpret the image to make the diagnosis. So verification is, do you have the resolution that you specified in the specification? And validation is, can the clinician effectively interpret the image and make the diagnosis?
Gotcha. That is helpful. So Brian has another question here, and we're rolling about halfway through the questions, and they just keep coming in. So we're going to try to get to as many of them as we can. So Brian asked, for several sections, design inputs, outputs, V&V, you mentioned levels of maturity. Is there a certain level of maturity that is required for a successful FDA submission? Or are these best practices to implement as your company grows?
There is no there's no guidance document. There is no regulation that tells you these things, and those levels are made up by me based on my experience. Though I will say those that are higher up on the maturity levels in each of those areas are much more prepared for their inspections, their ISO audits. They're able to more effectively answer questions and respond to things. They're less likely to have gaps and deficiencies. But there isn't a specified minimum, though I will say some of the things that were accepted 10 years ago are becoming deficient today, and so I would expect the industry, things that are now kind of state of the art are going to become standard practice as we go forward, and that's one of the key elements of this presentation, is that that things change and evolve, and what is acceptable today is not going to be good enough tomorrow. That whole concept of continuous improvement. And I think one of the key takeaways of this presentation really is around the importance of working towards those compliance or trace matrices.
That's great insight there, Jim. And you said something that really kind of sparked some interest for me. You said what's good enough today will be expected tomorrow. When you look at risk management in particular, and how much more of an emphasis that's been put on risk management, especially with the new ISO 1345-2016, your processes needing to be risk-based. Maybe what was good enough in terms of risk management 5, 10, 15 years ago may not be up to snuff today. How have you seen the evolution of risk management and how that relates to your design controls?
So great question again. Like I mentioned before, I would see this, the FMEAs, the risk files, be something that was done during the design and development process and got filed away, and didn't get pulled out again until there was a major modification to the product or needed to be plagiarized for the next product that was being developed to build off of. Nowadays, I'm seeing inspectors ask, auditors ask to demonstrate that your field data and how that links back, and does it match your risk files, and so it becomes a much more of a living document, and it really needs to be managed that way.
Well, that brings into a great next point of keeping that living and keeping that managed, and not just filing it away. So when you're using spreadsheets and some of the older tools to do this, what are some of the common problems that you see people running into trying to manage their design controls, risk management, using maybe some of these general purpose tools in the past?
Anything from little things from how do you, if I've got a spreadsheet and I pull that together and I identify a new risk and I need to add it in, do I take that new one and fit it into the section of the risk file where that general risk is being addressed, or do I tack it down at the end of the file? Because if I go ahead and generally it ends up being tacked on the bottom of the file, so now all my similar risks are not clustered together anymore. Because if I insert the line in there, if I've ever in any of my other documents made reference to a line entry in my spreadsheet, and I've inserted new lines in there, now all my references are completely messed up, is an example of some of the pain that happens from that.
Yikes. Yeah, that would not be fun to go back and check it out. I got some people saying yes to your response there. So we're right up on time here. I'm going to get one last final question here. Thank you, Jim, for spending the time and answering these questions with us. So last question here comes from Carlos. Carlos asks, how does customer feedback from the marketplace, aka complaints, impact on design control risk assessment, and what does required inclusion of new failure modes require?
Okay, so the linkage there, so feedback. If I have an incident rate, let's say during the risk assessment and during the design process, and you had gone through and said this was an acceptable risk because this particular failure mode, while severe, is negligible. It's going to happen 1 in a million. However, you have in the field, you find that occurs at a 0.1% failure rate or something, and you could say, oh, it's no longer negligible. I have to increase the probability of occurrence. Now my RPN for that is no longer acceptable. Now I have to create some other sort of a mitigation to address that because of the severity of that particular failure mode. So that's an example of how that feeds back in and can drive a need for updates or modifications. Also, through your investigations, you can find new failure modes that weren't anticipated during the design process. And now I have to add those, assess the risk, and see whether or not those risks are acceptable. So I need to provide that feedback in.